This morning we're going to start a new series on the life of Joseph. And he lived in the time that's recorded in Genesis. And so we want to start with a general outline of Genesis, just very generally, very briefly. Genesis 1 and 2 begins with the creation of the universe, of everything. And then chapters 3 through 5 records the fall and its effects. And there in the fall, humanity started to go through two different paths. One that repented and relied on God. God sacrificed to bring them back to Him. And then those who rebelled and continued on in a different path. And that escalated, those two paths escalated so much so that when we come to chapter 6, we see that all of humanity was so wicked and had nothing but evil in their minds that God just made a decision and a judgment to destroy all of humanity, except for Noah and his family, who was on a different path, a path of righteousness. And that's recorded in 6 through 9, the judgment upon humanity with the flood, and then Noah being safely, basically restarting the human race through his family. Chapters 10 through 11, we see the episode of the Tower of Babel, where God told them to go out and multiply and spread out throughout the whole world, the whole earth, and they disobeyed. They clumped together and they started to make this tower. And God separated them by changing their languages so they couldn't understand one another. And then through that, the narrative focuses on one family, where we get to the patriarchal period, where we meet Abraham in chapter 11. He's first called Abram, then he becomes Abraham. And through Abraham, God promises to be his God, to have a special relationship with him, to give him the land of Canaan, to multiply his descendants, and thus through him there would be great nations, and that God was going to bless the world through him. And that is really in two stages of blessing the world through Abraham. One was through his witness and through his testimony of his relationship with God. He was going to be a representative. He and his descendants, his family, were going to be representatives of people who were in right relationship with God. How to have faith, how to relate, how to walk with God. But then also, in those words, God communicated that there would be a particular descendant through which he would bless all the world, referring to Christ. So that was veiled in the Old Testament, but brought about and unveiled in the New Testament. In chapter 21, we see that Isaac is born. He is the son of promise, through whom God's promises will continue. The end of chapter 25, Jacob and Esau are born. Jacob would be the son who would be favored, through whom God's promises and covenant would be applied to. And then we had the story of the 12 sons of Jacob, which began roughly in chapter 29. And among those 12 sons, we see Joseph is going to be one of them. Now, historically, Joseph lived from 1916 to 1806 BC. Before Christ, so this is in ancient times. His record is from Genesis 30 down all the way to 50. There's a few chapters in there that do not communicate about Joseph, so we're going to kind of hop from chapter to chapter where Joseph is mentioned. And this is the patriarchal period. It's during the Middle Bronze I era. There is not much known about the history of the world at this time. There are a few things in Egypt. We're in the 12th dynasty of Egypt. And there's some other things in Syria and Iran, but for the most part, in the rest of world history, there's not much known. It is that ancient, that far back. So this week, in the life of Joseph, we're going to look at the biblical record of his birth and his childhood. So we're going to look at those two episodes that are written and recorded for us in Genesis. Now, his birth and his childhood, they're contained within the larger story of Jacob's life. So the biblical text and narrative is going to be focused on Jacob. And then we're going to see that Joseph comes in, his birth and some comments and verses about his childhood. And so we have to start by studying Jacob's life and his story to get a context, to get up to speed. But these two brief, almost side notes about Joseph, they're extremely important about building a foundation for his story. I mean, all these stories are intertwined. It's amazing to me in the biblical text, no one's story just begins. It's always connected to what happened before, to their parents. When Joseph is born, he's born into circumstances, and he's being raised with people. No one's an island. We as parents and friends, we all share in the circumstances and the life of children. And we're going to see that. So let's start with the first episode, which is the birth of Joseph. Okay, so in order to give you the proper context of that, I want to start with two major interactions between Jacob and his brother Esau, who are the parents of Joseph. Abraham and Sarah had Isaac, who married Rebekah, and Rebekah had twins, Esau and Jacob. So where I want to pick up is in Genesis 25. We are told that Esau is a skilled hunter. He's more aggressive. He's more of a manly man. And he was Dad's favorite. He was Isaac's favorite. And it's fascinating. The scriptures talk about it was Isaac's favorite because Isaac liked a good meat dinner, a good steak dinner. He liked the game. And it also communicates that Jacob was his mom's favorite, was Rebekah's favorite. And it says because he was more civilized and he lived in tents. And so right from the early start, we see favoritism, which is not going to play well. And in that chapter, we're told that Esau, one time when he was out on a hunt, he came back and he was starving. He was so hungry. And Jacob had a lentil stew already made. And he exchanged a bowl of that stew for his birthright, meaning his right to inherit the land. Esau, in his exhaustion, said, well, what good is land and a birthright to me if I'm dead? So I'll trade it because I need food right away. And then we move to chapter 27 in Genesis, where Isaac is old, and he wants to bless Esau before he dies. And that blessing is going to be a blessing of position, meaning authority, that you, the eldest son, Esau, will rule over Jacob and the household, the servants, and everyone else. And also a blessing of the land, by asking for God's blessing on the fruit of the vine and on the grain. And it's fascinating that Isaac thinks he's going to die, that he's old, and yet he lives more than 20 years beyond this point. He actually dies in chapter 35 in Genesis when he's 180. But anyway, he must have had a downturn here. Must have had an upturn in his health after this. But he believes that he's going to die soon, and he wants to bless Esau. So he says, go out, get me my hunt, get me some wild game, make me my favorite dish. I'm going to eat, be happy, and bless you. Rebekah hears it, and at this time, Esau had married 2 Hittite women, and Rebekah can't stand them. And so she wants Jacob to have that blessing of authority and the produce of the land. And so they deceive. Jacob agrees, hesitantly, but he does agree with his mother, and they deceive. They kill some goats, they put the skins on Jacob, they put Esau's clothing on him. Isaac, who is nearly blind, is fooled and gives Jacob the blessing. Esau comes back finally with his dinner, and his father is saying, what are you talking about? I just blessed you. The deception and the trick was found out, and then this is Esau's reaction. So Esau bore a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, this is meaning it wasn't an internal thought, he said it privately among his own people, the days of mourning for my father are near. Then I will kill my brother Jacob. Meaning my father's about to die, we'll mourn for him, and then I'll take my revenge. Little did he know that it's going to be another 20 or 30 years before his father dies, but In verse 42, now, when the words of her elder son Esau were reported to Rebekah, she sent and called her youngest son Jacob and said to him, behold, your brother Esau is consoling himself concerning you by planning to kill you. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice and arise, flee to Haran to my brother Laban. Stay with him a few days until your brother's fury subsides, until your brother's anger against you subsides, and he forgets what you did to him. Then I will send and get you from there. Why should I be bereaved of you both in one day? So obviously Esau is very angry at his mother, and she's afraid that she's going to lose Jacob as well. This is the last that Jacob hears of his brother before he leaves. This is the idea, the concept that he has. These are words of revenge and death. So Jacob's about to leave, and he's setting off for Haran. But what he thinks about when he thinks about home is Esau and revenge. So he's setting off for Haran. He is living now in the Negev in south of Israel, and or the south of the land of Canaan, and he's going to travel all the way up to Haran, which is close to 400 miles away. And while he's taking that trip up, when he reaches Bethel, we have that famous story where he has a dream and seeing the angels go up and down Jacob's ladder, or going from heaven and down to earth. And it's at this time where God speaks to him in a dream, and he says, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give it to you and your descendants. Your descendants will also be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west, to the east, to the north, and the south. And in you and in your descendants shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, I am with you, and I will keep you wherever you go, and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. So here now, he's leaving the land with also promise, with the promise of God. And what does God promise here? He promises 5 things. Number 1, he promises this particular land. He's going out of the land, but he promises that Jacob will own this land. His descendants will be vast, that he will have a privileged position of blessing, that God will keep him safe, and that God will return him, that he will return to this land. So, Jacob is setting off for Haran with 2 thoughts. This land is associated with revenge and possibly his death from Esau, but the land is also connected with God's promises. So we see a major theme in this section of Genesis, which is the danger and hostility of mankind and of humanity, the people around you, but yet God's promises and God's blessings. So, the next we find out is that Jacob finally reaches Haran, and there he meets Rachel. When he first gets there to the well, where Rachel comes in with the sheep and is going to water her sheep. And Rachel is a daughter of Laban, which is Rebekah's brother. Jacob, when he sees Rachel, falls in love. And agrees to work for her from Laban, to pay that bridal price for 7 years. And the scriptures say that 7 years just fly by because Jacob loves Rachel so much. And Laban has the wedding feast, and on the first night, he switches the brides and tricks him and gives him Leah. Jacob wakes up. He's surprised. What have you done? I've just united with Leah, and I worked for you for Rachel. Well, Laban just says, well, it's not our custom to give away the younger before the older. So, you have to marry Leah first. But then he's almost like a used car salesman. But this is what I'm going to do for you. Go ahead. After the 7-day feast, basically your honeymoon, the feast of your wedding with Leah, and then I'll give her Rachel. So then I will do another feast, it's implied. But you're going to have to pay for her too. So you're going to have to work another 7 years. And so Laban tricks him. You would think it's family. It's my uncle. I should be able to trust him. But he's not a believer. I mean, you can see from his life that he is selfish and he's deceiving. So basically, I mean, the take-home point from here is you really need to read the fine print of the marriage contract. Jacob should not underestimate the selfishness and deception of man. And thus he has to be, and we have to be wise when we're dealing with others. We have to clarify. So Jacob agrees that he's going to work for 7 more years. And Laban, he gives Leah a servant, Zilpah, and Bilhah is going with Rachel. So after the initial 7 years of labor, Jacob has to work another 7 years, but he has now 2 wives and 2 maidservants in his household. So God is building his household. And the situation there is that Jacob loves Rachel. That's his girl, his sweetheart, the girl of his dreams. But he's also stuck with Leah. And starting back up in Genesis 29, verse 31, it says, "Now the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, and he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren." So the text seems to imply that this is a divine favor given to Leah to comfort her and to bring her some kind of joy in this union, in this marriage, in her new family. And although Rachel remains childless, do we know of any other famous women in the immediate context right before who were also barren? Yeah. In Genesis 11:30, Sarah was barren, and she had no children. And then also Rebekah. Does Isaac praise the Lord on behalf of his wife Rebekah because she was barren? Sarah had Isaac, and Rebekah had Esau and Jacob. Specifically, Isaac and Jacob were going to be the sons of God's promises, to whom the covenant will pass. So, by Rachel being barren, the text is setting us up to expect great things to happen from this child, from a child that Rachel is going to have. And it's setting us up to believe that child is going to be the child through whom the promise and the covenant is going to go. Now, in this context, in this culture, a male child was extremely important because that male child would be an heir. It would inherit the life's work of the family. The land, the business, the wealth, everything would be passed down. That male child, would inherit and continue the family's name and reputation, as well as the family's history and memories. It was extremely, and in this particular case, it's also God's promises, his covenant promises. So it is extremely important in that culture. Women that could not have children were often devalued. There are also secular documents at the time that says that women that couldn't produce were sometimes discarded, divorced, or just banished, and they would have to go back to their relatives. So this was a precarious situation, and it was viewed very highly that women should be producing at least a male child. So God opens Leah's womb, and she has 4 children. Okay, the first children she has is Reuben. And when she's gave birth to Reuben, she says, "The Lord has looked with pity on my oppressed condition. Surely my husband will love me now." Awfully sad. But notice how I highlighted or I bolded the word looked. Reuben means, look, a son. And so she's associating the name of Reuben with her condition, with her situation of look. And then Simeon, the second, is born. And she says, "Because the Lord heard that I was unloved, he gave me this one too." And Simeon means heard. And then Levi came. And she says, "Now, this time my husband will show me affection, because I have given birth to 3 sons for him." And Levi, the name of Levi is slightly debated, but it either has the idea of affection or being joined together. But look at her. Look at what's in her mind the most. when producing this male child. She's desperately longing for his love, for his affection, to be treasured, to be valued. She was seeking her own worth and value, an object of being loved by someone else. She was going to fail there. Where should her value be placed? Where should she get her value, her worth, her love? From God. She needs to find that from God. It's not wrong to want to be loved by your husband. But regardless, your worth, your value comes from God. Then finally a fourth child came, and this time she says, I will praise the Lord. And she named him Judah, which means praise. He will be praised. So all of this happens, and by the way, you may think, before the first three, she's kind of looking at herself and love, and then finally she gives up and says, praise be to God. No, unfortunately, because of what happens next, that's not the case. It's basically just saying, praise be to God, I have another. And hopefully God will bless me as well with my husband's love. Okay, this happens all within the first 4 years of marriage. So that means that no one else is having children, meaning Rachel. So somewhere during this time, these first 4 births, and it's probably when Leah found out she was pregnant for the 4th time, that Rachel falls apart. Picking up in your Bible, chapter 30, verse 1, it says, Now when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she became jealous of her sister. And she said to Jacob, Give me children or else I die. You can see the emotional state of Rachel. She's going crazy with grief and with pain. And she's not thinking rationally. Because is it Jacob's issue? I mean, is it his problem? Can he just give her one? No. But she's expressing her anxiety, her insecurity. She's afraid that he won't love her, that she won't continue to be the object of her love and security. And as the popular Christian comedian of our century says, happy wife, happy life. His love, Rachel, is not happy. And that makes Jacob unhappy. It makes his life miserable. Look how he responds. And Jacob's anger burned against Rachel. And he said, Am I in the place of God, who was withheld from you the fruit of the womb? She's upset and unhappy about circumstances in which he can't fix. And if the person you love, if you can't make them happy, it seems like that's the end. So here you can see Jacob's anger, his frustration, because he can't help. He can't do anything to change the situation. So, in this emotional state, this irrational thinking, what does Rachel say? Verse 3, she says, Here's my maid Bilhah. Go into her, that she may bear a child to place on my knees, that through her I too may have children. So basically, have a child, it'll be for me. Now, has this happened to anyone in the past that we know of? Yeah, Sarah as well in Genesis 16. So Sarah said to Abraham, Now behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please go into my maid, who is Hagar, and perhaps I will obtain children through her. And Abraham listened to the voice of Sarah. So, once again, the narrative is building expectations, right? So is Bilhah going to produce that child, that special child? No. We're expecting Rachel in the future. So, just as a side note here, how do you think things are going now with the sisters for the first 4 years of this polygamous marriage? How well are that family bond is going? Not so well. So, through Bilhah, whom Rachel gives to Jacob, comes Dan and Naphtali. And when Dan was born, Rachel says, God has vindicated me, has judged positively for me, made a judgment in my favor. and has indeed heard my voice and has given me a son. And because Dan means judgment or vindication. And then Naphtali comes. And when he is born, she says, with mighty wrestlings or with mighty struggles, I have wrestled with my sister, and I have indeed prevailed. Does that sound gracious? Does that sound, putting her face in it? Or being prideful? She's not kind at all. And this is probably happening when Leah stopped becoming pregnant. It was obvious that Leah wasn't having more children, and so then Rachel says, I've won. It is never good to gloat or to put painful circumstances into someone's face and laugh at them. So, how would anyone in that situation respond? Well, Leah gives her maidservant to Jacob. And the first son is Gad, where Leah says, how fortunate. How fortunate. God has blessed me with another son. And then we have Asher, which says, happy am I, for women will call me blessed. Now she's looking for the praise of other people, other women. With Gad and Asher, that's number 7 and number 8 of sons to Jacob. And then in the story in Genesis, we have it stops that flow of children, and it brings us an odd story about mandrakes. That's a picture of mandrakes. It's a flower, but it produces these little fruits that are size of plums, that are fragrant, and you can eat them. And one day when Reuben was out in the field, he finds these wild mandrakes and brings them back, and Rachel sees them. Now, these plum-like fruits, they're associated with fertility in the ancient culture. And remember, Rachel has been infertile for 5 years and longs to have a child. So Rachel asks for them. And how does Leah respond? Graciously? Does she sympathize with her sister's plight? What does she say? But she, meaning Leah, said to her, is it a small matter that to take my husband? And would you take my son's mandrakes also? She is bitter. She is still bitter. This is 5 years into it, at least 5 years, maybe 6 years into it, and she's still bitter. So Rachel said, therefore he may lie with you tonight in return for your son's mandrakes. When Jacob came in from the field in the evening, then Leah went out to meet him and said, you must come in to me, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrakes. What kind of family is this? What kind of greeting is that? Confusing. So after 5 years, close to 6 years, they're still fighting. There's no family unity. There's no peace. Would you like to come home to work to have this bickering? Is this what God had in mind for a husband and a wife? No. Polygamy is not promoted in Scripture. In fact, this whole episode shows the negative side, the division, the divisiveness. Marriage can't work the way it was functioned to work. You see Leah just starving for affection and love. And then Rachel being jealous. And Jacob wanting to please Rachel. And attentions being divided. And no unity, no peace in the home. So, surprisingly, Leah becomes pregnant again. And bears 3 more children, number 9, number 10, and number 11. With number 9, she says, God has given me my wages, my reward, because I gave my maidservant to my husband. And thus she names him Issachar, which probably means man of reward. Now, notice what she says. Is that good theology? Is she right? No, this is not a reward. And what does it show us? It shows us that God blesses us in spite of ourselves. God is being gracious, even though Leah is way off. She's given another son, number 10, is Zebulun. And she says, God has endowed me with a good gift. Now my husband will dwell or will with me or will honor me because I have borne him 6 sons. She's still looking for his affections. Still looking for love, a place of honor. Then we hear in the narrative, almost like a side note, that, oh, by the way, she had a daughter. And that's number 11. She has a daughter. Dinah is her name. And it's interesting because Dinah means judgment. It is from the same root as Dan. So remember, Dan is a child from Rachel. So it's possible that Leah here is maybe giving a little dig, saying, see, I have the greater judgment. Look at all of my children. God has clearly made a judgment and a decision in my favor. Now, all of this is by way of introduction. So now we're ready to begin. So, how would you like to be in this family? What does this family look like? There's unlove, there's bitterness, there's jealousy, there's fighting, there's depression, and there's great division and hostility. And so after 6 years, the text continues and says, then God remembered Rachel, and God gave heed to her and opened her womb. So she conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. She named him Joseph, saying, may the Lord give me another son. So the Lord remembered him, and she says that God has taken away my reproach. My reproach meaning it's a cutting taunt or a painful ridicule that someone is saying because of her unfavorable conditions. And whether it's real, people are really ridiculing her, or it's all in her mind, it's probably a combination of both. But remember, it is shameful in that culture not to have children. So by having a son, her shame was lifted or taken away. Now, Joseph means added. But it sounds like the verb that's used for taken away. So there's a play on words here with the 2 sentences. It sounds like taken away, but it means added. What she says, may the Lord give me another son. Now, you may think, okay, Rachel, you have one. Be happy. And that's not really what she's saying. She'd been waiting for 6, almost 7 years for this child. And it's a male child. So the joy of seeing, it's a boy at birth was probably overwhelming. And this is probably the thought behind her statement of, this is incredible, this is so great, may the Lord give me another. May it happen again. So Rachel was the wife whom Jacob loved more. So Joseph would be the son whom Jacob would love more. So we see in the text here that God was the one who remembered. Not that he'd forgotten, but when the scriptures talk about God remembering, it's that he sees the plight and actually does something about it. He remembers, he does something, and he opens. He's the one that closed, and he's the one that's opening. It shows that God's sovereign plan, his sovereign hand is all through this story. Okay, so how does Jacob respond? Look at the next verse. It says, now it came about when Rachel had borne Joseph that Jacob said to Laban, send me away that I may go to my own place and to my own country. So now with this, the 7 years of his labor is ending. But he could stay. But when those 7 years, and especially Joseph being born, now he starts thinking of thoughts of the promise, of the land that God promised him. So this is a special child. And therefore, in this episode of Joseph's birth, we see that he is born into great turmoil and division. That he's born into great love and favor of his father and his mother. He's born with great expectations as far as the narrative is concerned. For we, the readers, are expecting incredible things from Joseph. And then also that he's born associated with God's promises. Okay, so what happens next? Joseph goes to Laban, and Laban convinces Jacob to stay with him to build his fortune. And Jacob stays another 6 years, and God blesses everything he does. and he becomes wealthy with large herds of goats, sheep, oxen, camel, many female and male slaves. And Laban's, and so much so, it happened so fast and he grows so powerful that Laban's people started to get jealous and started to complain, saying, he's taking all of our wealth. He's prospering and we're not. And so with that envy growing, and God also giving him a dream, that causes Jacob to leave Haran. And he's leaving for the land of Canaan. And he's afraid of causing trouble, so he goes without telling anyone. And here, it's in this trip of going back that we see a glimpse of Joseph's childhood. Specifically in chapter 33, verses 2 through 7. So as Jacob begins his trip from Haran all the way back to the Negev, he's thinking of the theme of promise. That's foremost in the narrative. But also in the narrative, behind there's also the idea of revenge. Because in that same land, that's where his brother Esau is. And the last time we saw him, Esau was ready to take revenge. So, it's 20 some odd years later. Is he safe? Does Esau still harbor ill will towards Jacob? Esau said, when my father dies, I'm going to take my revenge. Has his father died? Jacob hasn't heard any news about his father. So he has that in the back of his mind. God has made these promises, but also I know that there's danger. So when Jacob travels down and reaches right about here, I'm going to zoom him in, reaches this area, he settles and makes a camp and sends his servants ahead of him to make an initial contact with Esau. And he does it with humility. The servants return and report that Esau is going to come out and meet Jacob with 400 men. So that builds this fear. Why would he need 400 men? So Jacob sends gifts ahead of him from his flock and the herd and camels and donkeys, and to give his brother blessing. Now it's really important to see this connection, because remember, Jacob stole the blessing that was due Esau by the trickery. And in this episode, Jacob is trying to restore that. He's giving those gifts of the land, the animals, the provision that he stole from Esau from that blessing. So he's trying to reimburse him to make things right. And in chapter 33, verse 1, it says, Then Jacob lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the two maids. And he put the maids and their children in the front, and Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph last. But he himself passed on ahead of them and bowed down to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. Now that bowing 7 times, that is cultural. Rulers who were under greater rulers would bow 7 times to them. So basically by doing this, Jacob is trying to be humble, trying to say that Esau is over him, restoring that position, the blessing of position and authority over the family that Jacob stole. And we see here that he made an arrangement of his family, putting the most precious, the people who were most precious to him furthest away, so that, if need be, if Esau was coming to really attack, the family who were in front would receive that attack, would be injured, and the family who was furthest away has the greatest chance of escaping. So it clearly shows preferential treatment to Rachel and Joseph. And that treatment would be seen by everyone, including the other 10 sons. And it must have been painful to think, gee, I'm expendable. This is how Dad views me. Puts me in the front of the line. Now, at this time, Joseph would have been about 6 or 7. And Reuben, who would be the oldest, is about 13 to 14. And then the rest of them would fill in through those ages. They know what's going on. They see. They can understand clearly what's going on. Moving on to verse 4. 4 it says, "Then Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him. And they wept. And he lifted his eyes and saw the women and the children and said, 'Who are these with you?' So he said, 'The children whom God has graciously given your servant.' Then the maids came with their children, and they bowed down. And Leah likewise came near with her children, and they bowed down. And afterwards Joseph came near with Rachel, and they bowed down." So we see Esau is an incredible example of forgiveness and graciousness, showing the importance of family over wrongs that were committed in the past. Notice in the text, though, the difference between children, ambiguous, and Joseph. It's not Rachel and her child, it's Rachel and Joseph. There's an emphasis there, showing the importance of this child and the preferential treatment of this child. And it illustrates a pattern that will produce motives of hatred in their family and rejection from the other brothers. And that motive will ultimately cause Joseph to be sold into slavery the next time we come together in our next story, our next episode. That's caused by Jacob. That's caused by his father, showing favoritism. Jacob says that God has graciously given him these children, which implies that they're all gifts from God and they're all blessings. But he doesn't treat them all the same. He doesn't treat them that way. His actions show preferential treatment. So here, at a glimpse of Joseph's childhood, we see that he's growing up with great wealth and growing up with favoritism, which we know because of the next narrative, but it's being built here, that he's also growing up with resentment. Okay, now these points are extremely important foundational points in the narrative that will shape how we are going to see and interpret the story of Joseph, his life, seeing these major themes. Okay, so let's move now to applications. Number one, like Jacob's experience, we will face hostility and threats from the world around us. But we also have the promises of God, promises to be with us, to be gracious to us, and to lead us. Number two, Laban is an example of the deceptive and greedy capabilities of man, even from his own family. The point is to be aware of man's sinfulness and act wisely towards others who do not live for God. Number three, our worth is not in producing children or in being loved by a spouse or any other personal accomplishment. These are blessings, but our worth is found in knowing God. Number four, it is clear that polygamy is not God's perfect design for marriage. And five, all children are gracious blessings of God to be treasured equally. The one sure way to divide a family is to show favoritism. And then number six, Esau is a great example of graciousness and forgiveness, showing greater worth to the relationship with his brother than wrongs committed in the past.